When you inherit billions from one of America's wealthiest families, you'd expect that money to provide security, freedom, and happiness for the rest of your life. Madeleine Astor discovered that some fortunes come with conditions so restrictive they transform wealth into a prison, forcing impossible choices between love and money that would ultimately destroy everything she held dear. Her story represents the dark side of inherited wealth, where legal clauses designed to protect family assets become weapons that punish the very people they're meant to benefit. From surviving history's most famous maritime disaster to becoming America's youngest billionaire widow, Madeleine's journey seemed destined for a fairy tale ending. Instead, she would learn that the Astor family fortune carried a price tag that demanded she sacrifice her personal happiness to maintain her financial security. Her tragic descent from unimaginable privilege to devastating poverty proves that sometimes the most expensive inheritance is the one that costs you everything else worth having. Therefore, in today's episode of Old Money Allure, we examine how Madeleine Astor's billion-dollar inheritance became her ultimate downfall. Some love stories begin with scandal, but few achieve the spectacular level of public outrage that greeted 18-year-old Madeleine Force's engagement to 47-year-old Colonel John Jacob Astor IV in 1911. Born on June 19, 1893, in Brooklyn, Madeleine Talmage Force grew up in a well-to-do but not aristocratic family that owned a successful shipping company and moved in respectable New York social circles. Her father, William Hurlbut Force, was prosperous enough to send Madeleine and her sister Catherine to prestigious schools like Miss Spence's in Manhattan, where Madeleine was noted as a brilliant pupil who travelled frequently to Europe. The Force family spent summers in Bar Harbor, Maine, where wealthy Americans gathered to escape the heat. And it was here in 1910 that 17-year-old Madeleine met her destiny in the form of one of America's richest men. Colonel John Jacob Astor IV was worth an estimated $87 to $150 million, roughly 2.4 to 4.1 billion in today's currency. Making him not just wealthy but genuinely one of the world's richest individuals. But Astor came with serious baggage that made him a deeply problematic romantic prospect. He had just endured a scandalous divorce from Ava Lowell Willing in 1909 after 18 years of marriage. Divorce was still considered social suicide in 1910, especially for a man of Astor's prominence, and his ex-wife had received a settlement of about $10 million, making their split one of the most expensive in American history. The 29-year age gap between Madeleine and Astor provided endless ammunition for newspaper cartoonists who lampooned them as Papa and the Baby, while high society reacted with the kind of moral horror usually reserved for actual crimes. When their engagement was announced in August 1911, the public reaction was so venomous that Madeleine reportedly collapsed from the stress of constant media scrutiny and had to retreat from public appearances. Finding a minister willing to perform the ceremony became a genuine challenge, as several Episcopal priests refused to officiate due to Astor's divorced status and the scandalous nature of the match. Eventually, a Congregationalist minister named Reverend Joseph Lambert agreed to perform the ceremony, reportedly for a fee of $2,000, approximately $56,000 in today's money, though he resigned from his church shortly after due to public backlash. The wedding took place on September 9, 1911, at Beechwood, Astor's Newport mansion, with Vincent Astor serving as his father's best man, despite the family tensions surrounding the marriage. Even Astor's own mother stayed away from the ceremony, and New York society largely shunned the couple, forcing them to flee to Europe immediately after the wedding to escape the relentless gossip and criticism. The Cincinnati Enquirer called their union a marriage of questionable morality, while rumours circulated that Madeleine's family had been paid off to consent to the match, adding financial scandal to the moral outrage. But Madeleine had achieved something extraordinary. She had married one of the world's richest men and gained access to a fortune that would make her one of the most powerful women in America, if she could survive the social consequences. What she couldn't know was that her triumph would be short-lived, and that history's most famous maritime disaster was already steaming toward an iceberg in the North Atlantic. carrying her husband to his death and her to a widowhood that would define the rest of her life. To escape the scandal surrounding their marriage, the newlyweds embarked on an extended honeymoon that would take them from luxury to tragedy in less than a year. The couple first sailed to Europe on the RMS Olympic, the Titanic's sister ship, before travelling to Egypt and Paris, where they lived as international celebrities while American society gossiped about their marriage. By early 1912, Madeleine was 5 months pregnant, and the couple decided to return to New York for the birth, booking first-class passage on the maiden voyage of the most luxurious ship ever built. They boarded the RMS Titanic in Cherbourg, France, on April 10, 1912, with their full entourage: Astor's valet, Victor Robbins, Madeleine's maid, Rosalie Bidois, her private nurse, Caroline Andres, and their beloved Airedale terrier named Kitty. Their parlour suite was one of the most luxurious accommodations on the ship, costing $4,350, approximately $50,000 in today's currency, for a journey that was supposed to mark their triumphant return to America. On the night of April 14, 1912, the Titanic struck an iceberg, and Astor initially reassured his pregnant wife that the damage was minor, trying to keep her calm as the situation deteriorated. As the reality of the disaster became clear, Madeleine demonstrated remarkable compassion by lending her fur shawl to third-class passenger Leah Axe to keep her young son warm, a gesture that newspapers would later hail as proof of her true nobility. The couple retreated to the first-class gymnasium, where they sat on mechanical horses while wearing life jackets, with Astor even cutting open a spare life jacket with his penknife to show Madeleine its contents and calm her fears. When it came time to evacuate, Madeleine, her maid and nurse were assisted through a first-class promenade window to board Lifeboat 4, which had been lowered to the A-deck to take on more passengers. Astor asked Second Officer Charles Lightoller for permission to join his pregnant wife in the lifeboat, citing her delicate condition, but was denied due to the Women and Children First protocol that was being strictly enforced. With remarkable composure for a man facing death, Astor calmly promised to meet Madeleine later, saying, "The sea is calm, and you will be all right," giving her what would be their final kiss. Madeleine's lifeboat was lowered at 1:55 a.m, with room for at least 15 more people, a haunting detail that would trouble survivors for the rest of their lives. John Jacob Astor IV died when the Titanic sank on April 15, 1912, and his body was recovered on April 22 by the cable ship Mackay Bennett, identified by his initials and a gold watch. When his body was found, he was carrying $2,440 in cash and diamond cufflinks, creating endless speculation about hidden jewels and the fortune that had gone down with the ship. Madeleine was rescued by the RMS Carpathia and arrived in New York on April 18th, devastated and wearing only the clothes from that terrible night, transformed overnight from scandalous young bride to tragic teenage widow. At just 18 years old, she had become what newspapers called the richest girl who couldn't vote, inheriting a massive fortune that came with conditions that would ultimately destroy her future happiness. But Madeleine's real tragedy wasn't losing her husband in the world's most famous maritime disaster. It was about to discover that the Astor family had built legal traps into his will that would force her to choose between love and money for the rest of her life. When John Jacob Astor IV's will was read, Madeleine discovered she had inherited a fortune that came with conditions so restrictive they would turn her wealth into a prison for the rest of her life. From Astor's $85 million estate, approximately $2.8 billion in today's currency, Madeleine received what appeared to be an incredibly generous inheritance that made her one of the wealthiest women in America. She inherited $100,000 outright, the annual income from a $5 million trust fund, an additional $500,000 annually, and the use of the magnificent Astor Fifth Avenue mansion at 65th Street. The inheritance also included the Newport mansion Beechwood with all its furnishings, a luxury limousine of her choice, 5 prized horses, and essentially everything needed to maintain the lifestyle of America's richest widow. But buried in the legal language was a clause that would prove to be the most expensive condition in inheritance history. If Madeleine remarried, she would forfeit the trust fund income and lose the use of all Astor properties. This wasn't just about money, it was about control, as the Astor family lawyers had designed the will to keep Astor assets within the bloodline and deter fortune hunters from pursuing the teenage widow. For 4 years, Madeleine lived as the world's wealthiest teenager who couldn't vote, controlling more liquid income than many robber barons' widows, but unable to sign large contracts without a male trustee's approval. She gave birth to the Titanic baby, John Jacob Astor VI, on August 14, 1912, raising him quietly at Beechwood while hosting small charitable events and living under constant media scrutiny. But in 1916, Madeleine made the decision that would destroy her financial security forever. She chose love over money by marrying her childhood friend William Carl Dick, a banker and sugar refinery heir. William Carl Dick was wealthy but not Astor rich, and while he could provide a comfortable life, he couldn't replace the massive income stream that Madeleine was about to sacrifice for their marriage. The moment Madeleine said "I do" to Dick in Bar Harbor, Maine, she instantly relinquished the $5 million trust fund income and lost the use of both Astor mansions, which reverted to her stepson Vincent under the will's terms. This meant that her decision to remarry cost her the equivalent of approximately $160 million in today's currency, plus the use of properties worth tens of millions more, making it one of the most expensive wedding vows in history. While she retained the $100,000 cash legacy and some personal assets like horses and motor cars, the loss of the trust fund income meant she could no longer maintain anything approaching her previous lifestyle. Madeleine and Dick moved to a more modest Long Island estate and had 2 sons, William Force Dick and John Henry Dick II. But the marriage lasted only 17 years before ending in divorce in Reno, Nevada in 1933. Just months after her divorce from Dick, Madeleine shocked society again by marrying Enzo Fiamonte, an Italian prizefighter and actor who was 26 years old and had a wife and child in Italy. This marriage was considered so scandalous that Madeleine was dropped from the social register, the directory of America's elite, completing her fall from the heights of New York society to social exile. But Madeleine's financial troubles were just beginning, as her new husband would prove to be not just socially unacceptable, but personally dangerous in ways that would threaten both her remaining money and her physical safety. Madeleine's marriage to Enzo Fiamonte in 1933 marked the beginning of the most devastating chapter of her life, as her Italian boxer husband turned out to be both financially parasitic and physically violent. Fiamonte had expected continuous cash infusions from his wealthy American wife, but when Madeleine couldn't provide the lavish funding he demanded, he responded with the kind of brutality that would have shocked even hardened boxing fans. According to court testimony during their 1938 divorce proceedings, Fiamonte broke Madeleine's wrist and ribs during violent quarrels, transforming the woman who had once been America's most sympathetic widow into a battered wife living in fear. The physical abuse was accompanied by financial devastation, as Fiamonte burned through Madeleine's remaining assets with spectacular efficiency, spending her money on cars, racehorses and jewellery while contributing nothing to their household. When Madeleine finally divorced Fiamonte in 1938 for extreme cruelty, the legal fees, hush money to prevent him from selling tell-all stories to tabloids, and his extravagant spending had rapidly depleted what remained of her non-Astor fortune. After their divorce, Fiamonte demonstrated his complete lack of class by selling a serialized tell-all story titled "I Married the Titanic Widow" to True Story magazine, earning more money from exploiting their marriage than Madeleine received in yearly alimony. By this point, Madeleine had lost not just her Astor inheritance, but also most of her personal wealth, forcing her to retreat to her last remaining asset, a small house in Palm Beach, Florida, that she had purchased in her own name. The woman who had once controlled an income equivalent to tens of millions of dollars annually was now living modestly in Florida, far removed from the Fifth Avenue mansion, where she had once entertained New York's elite. Madeleine spent her final years as a lonely figure in Palm Beach society, occasionally hosting illegal backroom baccarat games during ladies' afternoons to help pay expenses, a far cry from her days as America's wealthiest widow. Her health had been compromised by years of stress, trauma from the Titanic disaster, and the physical abuse she had suffered during her marriage to Fiamonte, leading to increasing reliance on prescription medications. On March 27, 1940, a maid found Madeleine unresponsive in her Palm Beach home amid half-empty sedative bottles, leading to speculation about whether her death was accidental or intentional. While Manhattan newspapers reported sudden heart seizure as the official cause of death, gossip columns suggested a possible overdose, reflecting the tragic end of a life that had been marked by both extraordinary privilege and devastating loss. Estate filings revealed that Madeleine died with less than $90,000 in liquid assets, a pittance compared to the fortune she had once controlled as the teenage widow of John Jacob Astor Force. The Fifth Avenue mansion where she had once lived in splendor now belonged to her stepson Vincent Astor, who ordered its demolition the same year she died to build a luxury apartment building, erasing even the physical reminder of her former life. Meanwhile, her son John Jacob Astor VI, the Titanic baby, spent 2 decades suing Vincent for a larger share of the family fortune, ultimately settling for just $250,000, barely 1% of the Astor wealth. Madeleine's story serves as the ultimate cautionary tale about the hidden costs of inheriting wealth with conditions, proving that sometimes the price of choosing love over money is everything you once had and everything you might have been. The woman who had survived the Titanic disaster, endured public scandal, and rebuilt her life multiple times, ultimately could not survive the financial and emotional devastation of her own choices, dying alone and nearly penniless at just 46 years old. And now we'd like to see you in the comments. Were you familiar with the inheritance clause that cost Madeleine Astor everything? We look forward to hearing your experiences with this story. And with that said, thanks for joining us for another episode of Old Money Allure. Cheers.